This is the Born to Be podcast, where we believe you were created on purpose and for a purpose. Each week, we deliver inspiration and interviews with today's top thought leaders who are living out their unique calling every single day. Are you ready to discover your true identity and become who you were born to be? The future is yet to be created. And now, here's your host, Darren Earlywine.
Darren Earlywine here with you. Got the whole crew from Radio Theology. Ryan and Lisa. Guys, say hello.
Well, hi there.
Hello.
It's time for another episode of the Born to Be podcast. Guys, we got Albert Tate on the podcast this week.
What a good speaker.
Oh, yeah. We got a chance to meet Albert at the Multiply Conference that we were all part of. At least it was in November, last November.
Yeah.
And Albert leads a church out in California. And just the diversity that they've gotten as a church is just really impressive. And Albert talks about in this episode of just what it will look like to really step into believing that God had a calling on his life and the weight of that moment. And I know all of us are believe that God's created us on purpose and for a purpose. We're moving towards that, but it's just cool to hear how Albert unpacks the weight of that. I think it's tough to step into that and stay in that vein.
Yes, I totally agree. I can't wait for you guys to hear this episode.
All right, here's the next episode of the Born to Be podcast, this time with our guest, Albert Tate.
I am so glad to be here on Born to Be. Had a great time with you at the conference and looking forward to having a great conversation. Thanks so much for having me. So we started a church in Monrovia. I'm originally from Mississippi, so I moved out here. My wife and I moved out here about 13, 14 years ago. And then in 2012, we got a vision for a gospel-centered, multi-ethnic, intergenerational church. And so we planted this church in the community we were living in Monrovia. And 70 years, in January, we celebrated our 7th year anniversary, and we launched our 3rd campus. So we have 3 campuses now. So really excited about God's faithfulness and what he's been doing out here. It's been pretty amazing to watch. It's been really cool and also very hectic. Fast growth isn't always healthy. So you got to fight for health in the midst of all that growth and scaling and all that kind of stuff. So my head spins all the time on a lot of leadership stuff, trying to figure out how do you scale when God's doing something really big and really fast. But it's when you hear the testimonies, when you see the baptisms, when you hear about the families that have come together, when you see the marriages that have reconnected, it makes it all worth it. You know what? I always had a sense that God wanted to do something great with my life. Both of my grandfathers were pastors. I grew up in a very Christian home. My mother was the piano player at our church. She was our musician. So I was at church all the time, and I always knew that God had given me something. I always believed that it was going to be great. I always believed that I was called to do something great. So it was always in me. I had to fight for it because there were seasons when I was insecure. I struggled through high school. I wasn't the smartest. I was bullied pretty strong in junior high. So I had to fight for confidence. I had to fight against my insecurity. But I'm just telling you, there was something in me that always had a glimpse of, no, I think God's going to do something great. The thing that I wasn't ready for is the scale and the scope of how big and how wide God was going to do it. You know that passage in Ephesians, he says he'll go exceedingly and abundantly above all that you could ask or think. Well, that's exceedingly and abundantly and above begins where your request and your thoughts end. And man, when I tell you my request and my thoughts were so small compared to what he did, he's gone exceedingly and abundantly above all of that. But God would just send people, teachers, that would just say, Albert, I believe in you. I see something great in you. It's more than what you're behaving. So I just remember a teacher when I wasn't turning my homework in her class. I was being lazy. She pulled me outside and she said, Albert, I see greatness in you, and this is not you. You are made for more than what you're doing now. And I remember that. It stuck to my bones, and she was right, and I felt it. But I had to fight my own insecurities. I think the enemy didn't want me to know who God had called me to be. So I believed his lies over God's truth for a long time.
So did that look like, a process of, in some ways, like fighting that sense of calling? I mean, what would you say was a struggle? Was it a fight? Was there ever a point where you kind of rejected that sense of calling?
No, what happened was January 23rd, 1994, I was a junior in the high school, but I had really fundamentally flunked out. There was no way I would have enough credits. So the next year, when my friends were all becoming seniors, it would officially be exposed that I don't have enough credits to graduate. No one knew it. It was the biggest kept secret in my life. I started smoking weed and hanging out with friends and skipping school, and I was just wilding out. And man, January 23rd, 1994, I sat on the back pew of a church, and the Lord spoke to me, convicted my heart, and I walked down. We grew up in the old school Mississippi Holiness Church, so when we would make a commitment to Christ, we would literally go down to the altar after the sermon.
That's how I grew up, man. Absolutely.
Yeah, so that walk, man, that walk from that last row all the way up to the front of the church and saying yes to Jesus, it just broke everything, and it changed everything. So in that moment, I said yes to Jesus, and bro, ministry just started pouring out of me. We immediately started a Bible study with other friends because that night several other young people got saved. I was in a Christian rap group, and we would go and start doing youth nights and stuff like that. So it was one of those things where I didn't go after it, but once I said yes to Jesus, man, some things just began to unleash and come alive in me. And I would find myself talking with an authority about who God was. And I didn't know where it came from. You know what I mean? It's not like I learned that. It's not like I sat down and planned to be that. It's one of those things God had just marked me. And his glory and his purpose just started oozing out of me. So I really don't know. I had nothing to do with it. Sometimes now even I'll find myself in meetings speaking articulately on a subject, and I have no idea where I learned that from. But I just think, like seriously, I'll be like, I don't know how I know that, but I know that. And you know, let's be clear. I'm not being arrogant. There are tons of things that I just don't know. You can look at my transcript from school and see that. There are tons of things that I just don't know. But I just think God has strategically, divinely placed me in rooms and spaces where I open my mouth and I feel like he speaks through me. It was kind of sounding a little spooky a little bit, but it's just true, man. Like church organization, my church, I pastored in Mississippi. I had 14 people. I don't know what it's like to be a part of a church with thousands of people. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But here I am thinking structures and talking about. So I feel like if God has a purpose and a calling on your life, bro, he put some stuff in you that you don't even know when that deposit got made, when you picked that up. But when it's time, when purpose is ready to be revealed, man, that stuff will come out.
Wow, that's huge, Albert. That's something people need to hear right there. Just that the understanding that God has. I love one of the passages that I teach from often in our spiritual DNA workshop is from 2 Peter, where it talks about that we have been given everything we need for life and for serving God through our knowledge of Christ. Like it's already been deposited. Like we have it once we have this connection with Christ, and it's a process of allowing ourselves to discover it as we walk into, understanding the way that God's divine nature works in us. But it's already in you, right?
It's already in you. It's one of my favorite passages. I remember teaching that at my little church in Mississippi, Pelahatchie, Mississippi, when I literally had 14 people. That's no embellishment. And I started with less than that. But when I finally convinced my mom and my auntie and cousin to come, we started growing, man.
Come on, Mom. You got to come to church.
You got to come, baby. You got to come. So, but that Peter, that passage, it says, I've already given it to you, and you have all you need. So it's already there. So many of us are looking for it outside of ourselves, but God is so faithful. He's already put it in us. All that we need, it says, for life and godliness. I just love that. So that's you're talking my language now, man.
So how does that, how did that practically start happening? It sounds like, you had things that you were interested in. What was the rap group called, Albert?
Well, here you go. It was called Straight Flavor. FLAVA. Hey, you laughing a little too hard.
No, listen, I love it. I was hoping maybe you could drop a couple lines for us.
Drop a couple of bars. I probably got about 16 bars in me. But we not, man, Lecrae may be listening. I don't want him to be getting insecure about his gift. You know what I mean? So I'm gonna leave that alone. But the whole concept was living the straight life of Christ with a little flavor.
Yeah,
so
I love it.
Adding like that kind of stuff. So man, we would just had our little beat machine, and we'd go to churches. But that was the beginning of God putting me on a platform, putting me with a microphone in my hand with 20 kids, and me inspiring them, me telling my story, me speaking truth. And we do concerts and stuff. And the Lord was just preparing me. So when I look at what I'm doing now, I'm blown away at how God was strategically positioning me and placing me and preparing me, man, some 30 years ago, which is pretty phenomenal. Well, 20-some years ago, yeah.
So is it, I mean, would you say that, Albert, it's kind of a deal where, like, at that point, I mean, what you needed for what you're doing now was already in you as far as God's Spirit and what He had placed in you, but like you were stepping into at least what you had imagination for at that point. Like, obviously, if you'd gone to and as you guys are starting a rap group and showed that part of Albert, what you're doing now, probably still would have blown your mind at that point. But you progressively just stepped into what God was giving you to do at that moment. Is that something as far as like strategy to help somebody understand how to just continue to walk into that next step that God has for them? Is that consistent?
Yeah. I think to try to begin to translate that to someone trying to navigate that today, you cannot underestimate the power of being in God's presence and being in God's purpose and being in God's plan. So a life of worship, so being in His presence awakens you to His promises, and then His promises will then awaken you to His plan. I really feel like what happened with me is once I finally confessed sin, got in a healthy place with God, I began to open my eyes to His promises. So yes, you have a plan for me. Yes, you want to use me for your glory. Yes, you've given me gifts and tools. Those gifts and tools are to be used for your glory. How do I do that? Then I begin to walk from the promise of it to now exercising the purpose. So that shapes even how you go to work tomorrow. I'm not working for that check. I'm working for the glory of God and to honor Him with what I do, my homework that I got to do. I can't just play around with not doing my homework. I'm representing the glory of God. And I feel like in that He began to put desires in me, and my desires became His desires. So when He says, I'll give you the desires of your heart, He's not saying, I'm going to give you whatever your heart wants. He's saying, I've taught your heart through my presence what to desire. And now you will desire my purpose, my presence, my promise, and then I will answer and I will meet and I will satisfy those longings and those desires because that's who I am. And I feel like He put a purpose. So let me come out of the theological spirituality. Let me come out of that and let me just make it practical. He put me in front of people and He gave me a desire to inspire people. So as I was seeking to do rap and be on the stage, I was fulfilling a desire that He actually put in my heart. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
The devil doesn't want me to go and inspire people. You know what I mean? That's
right.
Not anything. So I didn't get that God gave me that desire, and then I began to walk in the desires that He gave me in purpose. So I began to make decisions based off of what was making my heart leap out of my chest. I began to make decisions about school, about jobs, based off of what was making my soul stir and what was those gifts were stirring up. And that's how it shaped my practical decisions about where do I work, what do I do, what ministry do I launch, what sermon do I preach, those kinds of things.
See, does
that make sense?
Absolutely, Albert. I don't want you to miss that if you're listening. Is that the connection that Albert made there? Is that when you are faithful to be walking in the presence of God and obedience of that, it's chasing the greatest passion still present in your heart is the compass. It is the direction. If you're in the presence, you're following those promises. That passion is the guide. Which I think so often people think, well, at least I know when I was a teenager, I thought, well, following God, that's the stuff that I don't want to do, or following God's he's not going to let me do stuff that I'm really passionate about. But I've experienced the same thing, and I want our listeners to hear that God has will put the desires in your life that bring you great passion, but it's got to be in the right order first, as far as you understanding walking in His promises, staying in His presence.
Yes. That's exactly it. And it's so exciting. It's so powerful. It's God's I'm telling you, he's so faithful, Darren. We spend so much time trying to figure out stuff, trying to navigate different spaces. But if you trust him and if you get in his presence, you'll come alive in that compass. I love that word. He'll begin to order your steps. Man, I am living my best life. God is just taking care of me. He's doing his thing, and it's because I'm trusting him daily. Now, let me just do a little caveat. That doesn't mean I don't have problems. That doesn't mean that there are difficult seasons. That don't mean that there are things that I face that are just downright challenging. No, but in the midst of that, I know that I am here and God is with me, and that helps me navigate those difficult and challenging spaces.
And talk about that a little more, Albert, because I think, like you said, everybody has challenges. Everybody has pain. Life is hard, no doubt about it.
Yes.
But I don't think you can put a price tag on being in the midst of struggle, being in the midst of pain even, and having a deep-rooted sense of peace and purpose.
Oh, yeah. There's no question. So believers aren't people that now, because they have Jesus, they get out of crisis. They have a get out of crisis card. No. Y'all, folks that walk with Jesus, there's a reason why David says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. What he's trying to get us to understand is even when God is leading you, he will still lead you in dark places. There will be challenging places. There will be places that will feel like death is going to take you out. But he says, I will fear no evil because the Lord is with me. So the idea of a believer walking with Jesus is we will go through difficult places, but the Lord will be with us. He will walk with us, and that's why we keep walking. That's why we keep going. That's why we don't give up. That's why we don't have a hopelessness or a despair like the world does when calamity comes. Because in Jesus Christ, there will be trials, but he says, through him, I have overcome them all.
So good. Albert, a lot of times here on the Born to Be podcast, we look back on what has brought people to where they are today. But I kind of want to flip the script with you because I want to know what you're seeing, because you're walking in this purpose. You guys are seeing great things out in your church in Monrovia. But whether it be the church or just kind of within culture, within where what passions he's stirring in you, like what are you excited about? What are you passionate about? What are you seeing in the future?
Well, one of the burdens, because if you want to know my greatest passion, you got to know the greatest burden. One of the burdens that I have is how divided our people are. Culturally, socioeconomically, we are just a divided country. We're a divided people. And one of the most disheartening things of that reality is that Martin Luther King's words are still true. The 11 o'clock hour on Sunday morning is still the most segregated hour of the week. So as divided as the world is, when we look at the church, we are still just as divided. Yeah. We're not setting a prophetic witness to the world to say, hey, this is what it's like for us to come together. So that's a big burden, to see people that don't look alike, don't live alike, don't vote alike come together under the umbrella of something that's so much greater. And at our church, we're seeing that, and we're trying to multiply and duplicate that. We're a church that has Trump supporters and Democrat. I don't know who's going to be on the Democratic side, but we got people who support Hillary, who love Barack, who love Elizabeth Warren. In trying to navigate that, we got people that have extreme wealth and capacity, and then folks that are literally a day away from living on the streets or living in their cars. How do you get folks like that to come together and not be so divided like the world? I think the gospel brings us together. And when the gospel brings us together, it forces conversations that then help us to break the cycle and the perpetual injustices that face our world, right? So you talk about police officers and young black men unarmed. I think a lot of that is because we just don't know one another. We don't understand one another, so we're threatened by just the vision of one another. We become caricatures to one another, and we don't know each other's stories, and we're not able to relationally value one another because we're not in relationship with one another. I think the church can facilitate that kind of movement in our country and in our world, and I think we should be at the front line of that. I feel like we can lead that conversation, and it's the beginning of them being able to stamp out injustices that are impacting our children, and that will continue to impact our children's children. So that's some of the things that I'm burdened about and then thus passionate about, and where I'm seeing God really move and stir.
Albert, what's a practical step that you guys are taking out of fellowship to see that happen?
Well, one of the big things that we do is we recognize that racial reconciliation in that vision of coming together is an outpouring. It's a fruit of spiritual maturity. So it is a discipleship issue for us. It is not some secondary extracurricular kind of class. It's not like band or choir. It is a core competency. So since it's core to our vision of discipleship, we've created a Center for Racial Reconciliation, where we intentionally invite folks from our church to come, and we do a 2-day workshop where we walk through just some of the fundamentals of historic injustices, in helping us see privilege, helping us see some of the ways that racism has impacted us and shaped us and how we live and how we think. And we try to deconstruct some of those things. So we lead our people into intentional discipling conversations about race. That's one of the very practical things that we do at our church to help our people.
And can you think of a story of somebody who has seen the lights come on, or connections of the ways that you've seen relationships reconciled in those ways?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you have people now doing life with folks that they never thought, that they never understood, that they never saw. They have consciousness and burdens of things. So here's an example. I'll take it out of the race world, and I'll just give you one in my own life. When I grew up in Mississippi, so lingo, and that was a word that we would use for all kinds of things. We use it as a positive word. We use it as negative. We use it to say that something was really good. We also use it to say something that was really dumb. It's the word retarded. Mm-hmm. So we would use that word. I've got a friend of mine who has 2 children with Down syndrome. And in doing life with them, one day we're having an intimate conversation, and he begins to talk about things that people do that really just grieve him and that he really honestly hates. And he goes on for about 5 or 10 minutes on a rant about how people that use the word retarded are so offensive to him, and how he couldn't respect anyone that uses that word. And it was so personal. I'm sitting there and I'm shocked. I had no idea. I'm clueless of this thing. And I would use it, not regularly, but I wasn't opposed to use it. I didn't have that kind of conviction that I saw in him. I know that. Well, seeing something that broke his heart, and that it was something that I would innocently participate in, or naively rather participate in, man, I'll never use that word again. I'll never use that word again. And to be honest, I'm uncomfortable if people are around me using that word. Usually I say something, not because it affects me personally, but because it affects my friend. It actually does affect me. I think and when we think about race, we bring people into conversations to say, yeah, the issue isn't you being a racist. I'm not a racist, and that becomes the end of the conversation. No. But you need to know the racist things and burdens that people that don't look like you carry. And once you see what they're carrying, you, by virtue of your love for them and your love for Jesus, have a responsibility of carrying that as well, and making sure that you're not perpetuating a system that injures your brother or sister whom you love, who Jesus would say is your neighbor.
Wow, that's so good, Albert. And it seems to me like that it's so much more than. And I think we lessen the gospel when we make it that this is the story here is you were going to hell and Jesus died so you don't have to, and then you just kind of wait to die. Where understanding no, this is a part of not only you reconcile. I mean, I think about the scripture talks about, we've been given this ministry of reconciliation. Yes, we're reconciled in our relationship with God, but then the opportunity is for us to be, representatives and ambassadors of God, to see reconciliation and love bring healing to relationships, not just in our family, not just in our neighborhood, not just for the people that look and think and vote like us, but across the board culturally. Yeah,
it's a big deal. It's the vertical and horizontal shaped gospel. The cross is both vertical and horizontal, and I think God is giving us a visual of what He says: love the Lord your God with all your heart, and love your neighbor as yourself. So those are the two great commands that He gives us, and then He commissions us to go and do that. So we tend to love God really well vertically, but He's saying you also got to love me horizontally by loving your neighbor, because as you love them, you love me.
And I don't think that can't happen like for an hour on Sunday, right? I mean, it's got to extend out of the service.
Yeah, I call our people. I said we've got to be careful that we don't end up in cheap reconciliation and not deep reconciliation. Cheap reconciliation usually doesn't cost me much, and it's pretty comfortable and pretty convenient, and it's probably reduced down to the Sunday morning hour. But deep reconciliation means we actually sacrifice for one another so that we might see one another, understand one another, respect one another, and love one another. And then if you got all of that, then you're going to fight for one another. You're going to protect them, and you're not going to allow systems to hurt them or allow racism to continue to perpetuate pain for them, because you love them. So that's what I think God wants to do through the process of deep reconciliation.
I love that, Albert. Do you think you would have this much passion for this, Albert, if you didn't? Do you think that the journey of growing up in, you said Mississippi, right?
Yeah.
I mean, growing up in Mississippi and then transplanting out to Southern California, do you think you would have the same passion and perspective if you hadn't seen, like, at least even our culture in our country through those kind of two drastic lenses?
You know what? I think it's kind of just the thing that God had for me. I mean, to be honest, I think California, although you would assume is way more progressive, and in many ways it is, than Mississippi, but I tell you, the racism is just as deep and just as strong. The injustice is just as deep here and just as strong. When you look at our school systems, when you look at per capita, the Christian private school market out here, and what fueled it was the fear of integration of schools. So you've got all these schools that started in these private schools in Southern California, but if you look at their genesis, the angst was that we don't want to integrate. So what we'll do is we'll just vacate before we actually integrate, and we'll start private schools. So I think it's one of those things, man. God has uniquely designed us. I think you know a little bit about spiritual DNA. I think that's kind of an area that you could talk very well on. So let me not come into your world too much. But when I tell you, when I was born, I feel like He gave me a burden and a vision, and it just took me time to grow into it. So I think He could have placed me in Idaho, and I'd still have this burden. I think it's just been God's gift to me, and I'm not sure He used all of He used all those things to influence me and to shape me, but I think it was more so just this is what Albert Tate is called to do in the earth.
I love it, Albert. I think one of my biggest takeaways from our conversation, man, is just that idea that it's already in you. You know what I mean? That God, understand that God has placed you on earth for a specific purpose. And like I said, I don't care if it's Idaho, Southern California, Mississippi, is that as you walk in it, you and you're faithful to it, you'll discover it. You have to be faithful to it. You have to continue that process. But what would you say to somebody maybe as we wrap up, Albert, somebody who maybe is listening and it's like they're maybe at a place, maybe it's depression, maybe it's confusion, where they just don't believe that there could be a purpose for them. What would you say to them?
Yeah. You know what? I would say, number one, God is not intimidated by your doubts or your thoughts. He's not intimidated by your fear, and He's not repelled by it. So many times we create a culture where people have fears or doubts. They feel like they need to hide. Actually, you don't need to run from God in those moments. That's exactly when you run to Him, when you have fears and doubts. He's not intimidated by them. And I would say there's nothing everything else pales in comparison than actually getting in His presence. So instead of trying to figure out the next step, instead of trying to figure out the next move, figure out the next place. And that place is His presence. I would start to spend time with God and be reminded of who He is. Because I'd imagine you're probably trying to figure out what He does or what He's going to do next. And maybe that's not the assignment. Maybe the assignment is forget about what He's going to do, forget about what you need Him to do, and be reminded of who he is, because it is out of who he is that he shapes who you are. And it is out of who you are that you are able to then do what you do, because what you do will flow out of who you be. So oftentimes we need to go and reset and be reminded of who we be. And in order for us to understand who we are to be, we've got to be reminded of who God is.
That's it. That's the mic drop moment. And we're done. Albert, I love it, man. Thanks so much for taking the time with us today. If somebody wants to stay connected with you, or is there a podcast they can listen to, or social media? How do they stay connected if they want to know more about Albert?
Yeah, so I got a couple of things going on that I'm really excited about. I got the Albert Tate podcast. We just wrapped up season 1, so go online, wherever you get your podcast from, and check it out. I had great conversations on there. You'll love it. You'll laugh. You'll cry. You might even get a little irritated at some point. But the Albert Tate podcast is there, and also my Instagram, Albert Tate, on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. All of those things, you can find me under Albert Tate.
Phenomenal. Albert, thank you so much for just the knowledge you've dropped. Thanks for the journey that you're on. It's been inspiring. It's been informative, and I can't thank you enough, man.
Thank you so much, brother. Looking forward to being together soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Albert.
Thanks for listening to the Born to Be podcast. We'd love to hear from you. If you've got a question for Pastor Darren, a suggestion for a future guest, or if the podcast has made an impact in your life, get in touch with us at blackbirdmission.com. And if no one else tells you today, you were made on purpose and for a purpose. God is near to you, not far from you, and God is for you, not against you. Have a great week.